topic of today's session is off-season development for elite and professional baseball players with Pete Bommarito of Bommarito Performance Systems. At this time, I would like to take the opportunity to give some background on our presenter, Coach Pete Bommarito. Pete Bommarito is the owner and president of Bommarito Performance Systems. He is regarded as one of the top coaches in the industry for his innovative, scientifically based approach to sport-specific training. He has brought his nationally recognized expertise to the team of Bommarito Performance Systems. He is directly responsible for developing all protocols and implementing all programming. The advisory board for the performance, nutrition, and medical field that he has implemented provides scientific base for some of the most recognized and accomplished sources in the world. Pete received his master's in exercise science with a specialization in sport biomechanics at Ball State University and his bachelor's of science in biology pre-medicine from Missouri State University. He is a certified strength and conditioning specialist through the National Strength and Conditioning Association and is a level 1 certified club coach to United States weightlifting. Pete also has a jumpstart trained practitioner lower and upper body through Greg Rosenkopf muscle activation techniques program. Without further ado, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Coach Pete Bommarito.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? Kevin, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, we ready to begin?
It's all you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Today we're going to be presenting on off-season development for elite and professional baseball players. Now, this is a lot of the things that we do for our Major League Baseball, Minor League Baseball, and collegiate baseball players down here at Bommarito Performance. But keep in mind that a lot of this does apply to the high school and even the youth levels. It's very important to remember that these drills can be modified down for a lot of the youth. A lot of the warm-up and speed drills can be directly implemented, and a lot of the strength-based stuff and resistance-based stuff that we're going to be showing can obviously be implemented with the younger population. We just have to be modifications in terms of joint loading and things like that. And as we go through some of the strength-based stuff, I'm going to be discussing some of those modifications that can be made. But the most important thing is, even though the title of this is elite and professional baseball players, I don't want anybody to think that this cannot be transferred, because it definitely can be. Okay? In terms of some of the things that we're going to be discussing, I'm going to talk about a preparation warm-up. Now, with regards to the preparation, it's not just like a stretch or the active dynamic warm-up or anything like that. We don't look at stretching or anything like that, or even warm-up itself as what you do before an exercise, before a practice, before a game. What we look at as general preparation is getting the joints and the muscles ready to undergo whatever training mechanism you're going to be undergoing. Whether it is actually playing a baseball game, whether it is doing a speed and movement and conditioning session, or if it is doing some type of plyometric or resistance training, whatever, we're moving away from stretching or just getting the tissue temperature elevated. We're getting more of making sure that the joints are prepped and maximally ready for exercise. So if you're undergoing dynamic motions like throwing a baseball or swinging a baseball bat, all of the motions that are involved in that actual dynamic motion itself, the joints need to be specifically prepped, especially at the end ranges of motion, which is what we're going to talk about a lot. Movement training in itself, I don't want to think of as just speed development. I want to think of more of just efficiency of movement. I mean, whether you are or not a baseball player that needs to be running fast in terms of like a base stealing type guy, you still are going to run in the sport of baseball. And the more efficient you run, the less injury prone you're going to be. It's that simple. And beyond that, the less fatigue you're going to get throughout the course of the game and throughout the course of the season. So one thing we want to keep in mind when we're discussing movement training is not just speed development for speed-based guys. It's general muscle prep for every motion you're going to be undergoing in the sport of baseball. So obviously the end result is you're going to get faster by implementing some of these drills, but that's not really always going to be the main focus, because I don't want it to defocus people that are not like base stealing guys. Power and strength endurance is probably the basis of what we believe in, and the approach that we've used has been very successful. Okay, if you look at like pitchers, for example, they don't necessarily need a lot of base conditioning. They need local muscular endurance and lower muscular power capabilities that's prolonged over a period of time, like first inning to last inning, beginning of the season, the end of the season. Reactive neuromuscular training is just a basic fancy term for plyometric training, and we're going to discuss a lot of the variables in between what a plyometric drill that's normally thought of like a track sprinter and how it can relate to the different parts of baseball. Resistance training is obviously all of our weight room work. Now keep in mind that everything we do, including a warm-up in itself and the preparation, is resistance. I mean, whether you're resisting with an external load or you're resisting your own body weight, everything is resistance. But for simplicity purposes, we're going to classify resistance training as all of our work and preparation that is done in the weight room. And finally, I'm going to lead off with a multidisciplinary approach. And this is, I would say, the most underrated aspect of all strength and conditioning, not just baseball. We're going to discuss a lot of the disciplines that we use down here, and a lot of them that can be applied. I mean, I don't want people to think that just because we have 12 different medical disciplines in-house in this facility that, you know, it cannot be transferred and applied. A lot of things in terms of the success we've had with the different certifications and training mechanisms of our performance coaches can definitely be transferred over into, I'd say, any part of person in any aspect of any field, whether you're a high school coach, a high school sport coach, collegiate strength coach, professional strength coach, athletic trainer, even youth position coach. A lot of the stuff can be very, very applicable. Okay, so we're going to begin with preparation and warm-up. Now, just to recap some of the things that I was saying, again, you're going to see the term warm-up. You're going to hear me say active stretch, but we do not look at this as lengthening of the muscles. We look at this as prepping the joints. There's two main facets of what we believe in and what we have a success in our approach, and that is the active dynamic warm-up and the unloaded speed development. Now, whether we do this in season before a game, before practice, or before a training session, the main aspect holds true that if you're going to go a dynamic motion such as pitching, throwing, swinging, sprinting, lifting, conditioning, swimming, anything, you're going to need to prep the joints and get strong at the end ranges of motion and increase the range of motion and stabilize and continue to get strong at the increased range of motion. That is what preparation is all about. So to start with the first basic warm-up phase, which is the active dynamic warm-up, we have different types of modes within the actual warm-up. We have a specific sequence that all of our athletes undergo. Okay, the transit activation series is anything that's moving, okay? And we have different parts of every single transit series, which will obviously play with the video. So we have a slow isometric, a fast isometric, a dynamic stretch reflex, and then the actual dynamic motion. So I would say every single motion you see on the video, or what we have in our standard warm-up, is going to have those four basic sub-levels. The main reason how is the active range of motion control. If you begin with a slow controlled range of motion, you can identify at that specific time with that specific athlete, at that specific joint, what can they control. And the more isometrics you do that precedes each active motion, you're going to start to get stronger at their own range of motion. And as you start to build that isometric strength, the stretch reflex and the active motion itself is going to become a lot more successful. You gradually increase the speed of motion, and the final thing is we have a whole series of lunge series. We do a lot of 3-second isometric pauses of end range of motion of hip flexion, which will get them stronger at the end range of motion, which will transfer into any sprinting motion, whether it's a forward sprint, a rounded sprint like base running, first step off a base stealing start, or it's something as simple as like a back lateral run for outfielders. Then we transfer into local prepper joint mobility. We have some, again, isometrics that lead into dynamic motions, and we finalize with neuromuscular activation. Okay, so at this time, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind playing the AD warm-up video. Okay, this is the slow isometric right here. If you notice that when I'm trying to prep, I'm prepping the joint of ankle, knee, hip, and lumbopelvic stabilization. Okay, you increase a little bit to the fast isometric, so same motion, I'm increasing the speed with the ISO. Then you implement the stretch reflex, and then you open up the stretch reflex. So notice how I'm getting a little bit of a reach off of the knee and hip flexion. Then we go into the dynamic motion. This is actually the back butt kick skip, which leads right into the butt kick reach skip. So now it's notice the same heel flick, but now after hip flexion, there's a little bit of hip extension. Then you put it all together with an increased dynamic motion. After that becomes the active stretch. So again, I'm activating first and then going into the stretch reflex. This is just a basic hip separation, which ties into acceleration. Now we're looking at hip external rotation. Again, the slow isometric, which will lead it right into the fast isometric, which will lead into the stretch reflex, which you're seeing here from the front view. And this leads into the basic rhythmic skip. This is a baseline plyometric with external rotation. then a powerful skip, which is almost like an A skip with a little bit of external rotation onto it. Then we have the active stretch. You notice the same motion of hip external rotation with flexion. Then we're looking at adductor activation. Once the adductor is activated, you go through an adductor stretch. And again, with any lunge series, we do a 3-second isometric of hip flexion and range of motion. Then we go back to a rhythmic skip of a backward pivot, which will lead us right into the drop lunge active stretch. Again, the 3-second isometric at the top. Now we're in phase 2. So phase 2 leads on joint mobility, looking at hip mobility with lumbopelvic stabilization. Put that onto the hamstring series, which is lateral rotation of the femur and external rotation. Now we have the side lying series, which is abduction and internal rotation. Now we have all the adductor series, whether it's scissors low, scissors high. Lead us right into the hip flexion series. Again, isometric first, getting strong at the end range of motion, leads us in a more successful stretch reflex or an advanced hip flexion series. Or the knee flexion series. Again, iso. Now we're into trunk and spine. So the stretch reflex first. Again, isometric, leading right into the stretch reflex, isometric, leading right into the stretch reflex. Focusing now on the ankle joint isometrics, ankle joint stretch reflex. Now looking at just general ankle mobility, leading into an active stretch for the ankle joint and the knee joint. Now we're in the third phase, which is neuromuscular activation. Again, every single thing, whether it's flexion to extension, abduction, adduction, or even the windmill series, starts with a basic slow isometric leading into a dynamic motion. This is eccentric loading of the posterior chain. Once you get that eccentric loading mechanism down, you can start going under some stretch reflex mechanisms of hip extension, and then putting in a little more of a plyometric action. Okay. The next warm-up phase will be unloaded speed development. Now this is mainly done with track hurdles. Okay, we have preparation at each level that starts with a slow isometric into the fast isometric, then you have a march dynamic stretch reflex. The exercise sequence after the preparation will have 3 facets. It'll have A skip, exercise skip alternating side, A skip, exercise skip on the same side, then you have A skip and exercise skip on the same side with arm action. So the A skip is a general linear acceleration mode, which is just working on speed. The exercise, we have 6 different levels, whether it be lateral A skip, side A, the glute series, the adductor series, the windmill series, and the hamstring series. All these will actually be shown in the video. But remember, if you think of when you watch the video, everything is going to have a speed on one leg and the exercise mobility on the opposite leg. Okay, and then we promote it into speed on the same leg with the exercise mobility on the same leg. And then we do the same thing, but we speed it up with arm action. So Kevin, if you want to play the unloaded speed development video now. Kevin, do you want to play the video?
You want the hurdle mobility?
Yeah, the hurdle mobility. Okay, now this is the side A series, slow isometric. This is the side A series, fast isometric. Again, we're in the preparation phase. Now we have the stretch reflex. Then we have the stretch reflex continuous. Moving into level 2, which is the side A series. Again, you see the slow isometric. See the stretch reflex march. Now, this is A skip, side A skip, alternating side. A skip, side A skip, same side. Now, arm action. Again, you see the speed rep followed by the mobility rep. Everything dynamic. Moving into the glute series, similar to what we saw in the active dynamic warm-up. This is actually A skip, glute skip, same side. A skip, glute skip, same side, speeding up with the arm action. Now we have the third level, which is adduction series. You see the slow isometric. You see A skip, adductor skip, alternate side. And A skip, adductor skip, same side with arm action. Moving into the windmill series. You see A skip, windmill skip, same side. This is the hamstring series. See the slow isometric as the prep. Looking at A skip, hamstring skip, same side. And so on and so forth. So again, every level will have a preparation, It will have a dynamic reflex march, and then you can get into your A skip speed skips, which is a speed rep on one leg, and obviously the mobility rep on the opposite leg. Okay, now movement training, again, as we discussed earlier, is going to be a lot of, number one, it's going to get you faster. And number two is it's going to prep. I mean, because I have a lot of questions at all levels, whether it be professional, collegiate, high school, or even youth, is, you know, I'm not necessarily a base stealing guy. I'm a home run hitter. I'm a catch pitcher, whatever. Think of this as one simple term. When you're talking about movement training, you're talking about prepping the muscles, not necessarily prepping the motions. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to be watching on the video of the movement training is not necessarily going to be, okay, it's form running in terms of this is how you run. It's prepping the muscles at the end range of motion of hip flexion and hip extension, getting strong isometry through those ranges, and working on the stretch reflex mechanism that actually makes you faster. Okay, so with any linear sprinting, you're going to have recovery phase, you're going to have transitional phase, you're going to have ground preparation phase, you're going to have ground contact phase, you're also going to have residual phase, which is the moment your foot comes off the ground to the moment your foot starts to recover. Now, whether you're doing a lateral shuffle, you're doing a base heeling start, you're doing a first step off of a swing, you're rounding the base, you're doing a backward motion like an outfielder chasing down a fly ball, you still have all those facets of running. So if you prep the muscles in a very general sense through linear training, whether it be resisted, assisted, or just through technical drills, you're making the muscles more efficient at those facets of the motion. When you make them more efficient, that will transfer into any multi-directional motion, especially the baseball specifics like base stealing, base rounding, and infield motions and outfield motions, and even the first step of being a catcher. You know, the muscle's more efficient. It's always going to help you be more efficient, whether your goal is to get faster or just get more efficient. And believe me, the more efficient you are at running, even if speed is not your game, you're going to be a lot less injury prone, and most importantly is you're going to have a lot less fatigue during the course of a game and during the course of a season. So we break off movement training into two main categories. One is general, which we have linear acceleration, absolute speed, and footwork and basic agility. The second facet, we have the sport-specific motions, which will have, you know, lateral motions, which shuffling obviously is specific to infielders. The lateral run motion is specific to base stealing or the first step off of a base run, even if you're not stealing. You have forward multi-directional, which is circular pattern, which is specific to base running. Then you have backward multi-directional runs, which could be infielders and outfielders. So starting off with basic general movement training, it is important and it is specific, and here's the reason why. If you look at any motion where you're running from base to base, let's say you hit the ball and running down to first base, you will go through an acceleration phase and you will go through an absolute speed phase. Now, it's pretty common now, as anybody has a track background understands that you're not actually going to reach your true absolute speed or maximum velocity to hit anywhere between 50 and 65 meters. But the moment gravity dictates your body has to stand up, which for most standard baseball players is about 15 yards or halfway between the base, you're still going to be undergoing the absolute speed mechanics, even though your body has the ability to continue to accelerate. So the acceleration phase means you have a forward lean and your leg is moving in a piston-like action. The absolute speed phase means gravity dictated your body is standing up and now your leg is going through a cyclical pattern. So even though you have not truly reached your absolute speed of what your body is capable of as you're running the bases, gravity will dictate your body is going to stand up and you will have to undergo those motions. So keep in mind when I start talking about absolute speed when we're watching the video and you see the circular motion, it's not saying that you are running at your absolute speed. That is the mechanic your leg is undergoing at that given time that has to be trained. And general footwork and basic agility is, you know, ladders and rapid response drills that's just working on the neural component of basic plyometric actions and basic stretch reflex actions, specifically at the ankle joint. Okay, so Kevin, if you want to go ahead and play the speed video. Okay, this is rapid response, very basic. Rapid response lateral. Rapid response lateral with motion. This is a very, very basic lateral speed prep drill. If you notice, it can undergo basic lateral motions or the stretch reflex mechanism, which leads you into lateral run motions. Again, think of these drills as ankle prep. Notice when you do the agility ladders, it's got to be specific. Even with a multi-directional edge work like this, the arm is pumping and the knee is up on every single step. This is a basic stretch reflex drill. Now we're moving into linear acceleration with wall drills. This is strength endurance as well as the piston drive of just getting strong to the end range of motion of flexion and extension, which needs to be resisted. Or we go into like a resisted sprint isometric and into a resisted sprint just working on ground preparation. This is acceleration A-skip power working on the transitional phase of sprinting. Now we're moving into absolute speed, which is ankle to butt kick. This is absolute speed A-skip. Notice the cyclical pattern as opposed to the piston. This is absolute speed A run. Same motion, cyclical pattern, just working on more of a running motion. This is a moving claw series. Notice again the cyclical pattern of the leg. Now we're getting into more sport specific of lateral shuffle change direction. This is ankle prep drill looking on base stealing. This is ankle prep drill work on base stealing and base rounding. Here's our base stealing lateral shifts looking at the outside edge of my inside leg, which is my right leg. And back angle lateral run, which is specific again to both infielders and outfielders. So when talking about specifics, lateral shuffle motions, backward running motions, and backward angle running motions, the key aspect is edge work. You've got to be comfortable with that piston-like action, but when your ground hit, when your foot attacks the ground, there's additional challenges of stabilizing the ankle joint. So things that you saw us doing like that lateral wall drill and that Carrico quick step drill, that is very, very good preparation for hitting that piston action to perfection, with the difference being you have to have stabilization of the ankle joint as you're working off the inside and outside edge of the foot. So think of a base stealing start, for example. Once you go undergo that shift to your right, you have to be able to accelerate off the outside edge of your right foot, which will propel you into that base stealing motion. So the more prep work you can do to get that comfort level of stabilizing the ankle joint, the more efficient you're going to be at base stealing starts themselves. Remember, it's not so much of technique of how you shift and how you accelerate. If you just do those ankle prep drills, you're going to naturally get the person into a more explosive start. Now think of base rounding. If you're rounding first, you're rounding second, you're rounding third, you're actually accelerating off the outside edge of your left foot and off the inside edge of your right foot. So again, it's the same piston action of linear acceleration. The only difference is there's different challenges of stabilizing the ankle joint as you're rounding, and there's obviously additional contributions of the adductors and the abductor subsystem as you're going through that piston action. So this is why linear acceleration is so important for baseball, because you're prepping the muscles. You do your technical drills like wall drills and Carrico quick step to stabilize the ankle. Then you put it all together with your back lateral run, your base rounding motions, or your base stealing motions. So this is why we believe that linear and multi-directional and absolute speed and footwork is so crucial to baseball for one simple concept. We're prepping the muscles, and we're prepping the muscles that stabilize the joint at dynamic motions as we go through those movement patterns. So the end result is you're going to be a lot less injury prone, you're going to be a lot more efficient in terms of local muscular endurance, and for everybody that needs to get faster, you're going to be able to get a lot faster and a lot more agile. So again, every single one of those drills can be at any level. You know, obviously, when we're talking about strength endurance of the Prowler series, which was the drive sled, it obviously has to be modified for younger kids, but the same type of motion applies. Simple resistance to get them stronger and build up that local muscular endurance, which will transfer into all your multi-directional motions. Okay, now we're looking at power endurance. Now, power endurance does need to have a lot more volume with pitchers, but with position players it's still important, okay, because position players do have to throw, and obviously they have to undergo a lot of swinging motions. Now keep in mind that when you're training, you want to train both sides of the motion, and you want to train the decelerate components. So if I'm a right-handed swinger, I'm only going to be swinging at that from my right side. But when you train, you have to train from both the right and the left side for the simple fact that you don't want to create any severe imbalances. Now, one thing I want to touch on is strength has to be first. If you want to go to a dynamic rotational motion, that's great and it's very sport specific. But if you're not strong enough to handle that thoracic rotation, you're going to be doing a lot of unnecessary rotary motions, which is going to cause a lot of overuse injuries. So even at the highest level, we make sure that we identify what their thoracic mobility is, number one, what their dynamic mobility needs to be as a baseball player. If they're limited, we open it up to neuromuscular techniques in the weight room, and we get them stronger at those end ranges of motion before we ever get to the power endurance phases. So again, the controlled range of motion needs to be identified. And then we have different facets of power endurance, which is a rotational series, a scapular-thoracic series, even a medicine ball series. Now, the video we're going to show, just for time constraints, is going to be the rotational series itself. Now, when we watch the video, you're going to see it done on a Kaiser machine, which is a pretty high-end machine. We understand that not everybody has access to the Kaiser. So if you want to just have simple band, which is very, very cheap and easy to use because you can attach the band to any type of a post or a rack, everything we show in this video can be done with the use of bands. So Kevin, if you want to play the power endurance video. Okay, this is a high rotation. Notice my arms are straight, so we're focusing just on thoracic mobility. Mid-rotation into the low rotation. This is energy transfer from a lunge position, transferring energy from lower body to upper body, or transferring position from upper body to lower body. All right, this is elimination of lower body, focusing specifically on thoracic rotation, either from a kneeling or a split position. This is energy transfer from a punch position, or energy transfer from a lateral position. Now, if you notice, a lot of these things can transfer to both throwing and swinging motions. Now, again, we're not trying to recreate a throwing motion. We're not trying to recreate the swinging motion. One of the worst things I've seen people do is they try to take the throwing motion or the swinging motion and try to weight it up and put a bunch of bands and tubing and things like that. It's very simple. We're not training the motion of baseball. We're training the energy transfer. If you think of what happens when you throw a baseball, when a pitcher throws a baseball, or when you're swinging a baseball bat, there's an energy transfer that initiates from the lower body, goes diagonal through the core, and the energy is released to the upper body. It's that energy transfer mechanism that you want to train. So don't really worry about, is it specific to the mechanics of baseball? Worry about, is it specific to the muscle prep and the energy transfer that is actually occurring. When you start to think in those terms, you can see how important power endurance is. But remember, the most important thing is identification of their range of motion. If it needs to increase, you increase it. You get it strong, you get it stable, and most importantly, you get them isometrically strong at their end range of motion. At that time, then they are prepped for dynamic motions. Okay, moving along to strength endurance. Now, strength endurance was shown in the acceleration video. If you notice the prowler sled or the drive sled where he was staying behind the sled and undergoing those march and sprinting motions, that is probably the most effective form of strength endurance there is for the lower body and the trunk and upper body stabilization. It looked like it was a piston-like action, which kind of relates into, I would say acceleration training, which it will, but also it gets the local muscular prep and strong from a standpoint that everybody needs, from pitchers all the way down to position players, whether it's swinging, hitting, running, anything. You need the local muscular prep and need that strength endurance. And we also have some complex training. So if you notice the fourth bullet point down with complex training, you can do things such as weight room motions. So we're looking at shoulder raise series, shoulder punch series, rotational motions, anything that can be done for a period of time. So as opposed to looking at strength reps, building strength, you can take that strength and put some strength endurance on it. So as opposed to doing, reps of 8 for a shoulder raise series, you can do 30-second shoulder raise series through a dynamic motion, which leads to local muscular strength endurance. It's very, very popular for our pitchers. Okay, now moving into reactive neuromuscular training. Okay, now a little bit about the science. Again, reactive neuromuscular training is kind of a fancy term for plyometrics. Okay, and if you look at the difference between pitchers and position players, obviously pitchers need a lot more volume because that's all they really undergo is a stretch reflex mechanism. So think of it in terms of the most basic forms of plyometrics. If you think of a track sprinter, why do they do bounding exercises? Okay, a bounding exercise for somebody that has to undergo sprinting, it's very simple. You're looking for ground contact. Okay, how much force can you put into the ground with as limited amount of time as possible, which basically functions off of rate of force development. So a maximum amount of force in limited amounts of time. So bounding exercises, which is trying to limit ground contact as you're going through the bound, will make your stretch reflex mechanisms of your ankle, your knee, and your hip joint a lot more explosive, which will transfer into sprint. Now think of how that transfers into baseball. Every time you throw a baseball, there's literally dozens of stretch reflex mechanisms that happen in the thoracic region, in the shoulder region, in the scapulothoracic region, in the elbow, in the wrist. There's thousands, literally, of stretch reflex mechanisms that need to be trained. So that can be trained and enhanced just as a bounding exercise to be trained and enhanced through sprinters. So what we've done is we've come up with a whole RNT series for every single motion that is involved in swinging and throwing. So some of the motions we're going to be describing on video is chest, forehead, overhead, which is very, very simplistic stretch reflex mechanisms of the upper body, whether it be the chest, the shoulder complex, or the elbow extensors. Slams, hips, and shoulders are very, very general as well, working on more of the thoracic region. Hips works more on the hip region, shoulders works more on the thoracic, scapulothoracic, and shoulder regions. When you get into scapular and humeral rotation, do not think of this as rotator cuff. Rotator cuff is definitely an overused term. Okay, and a rotator cuff is 4 tiny muscles that will control humeral rotation, but they're not the only mechanism of what's involved in humeral rotation. Humeral rotation is exactly what it says. It's your ability to rotate the humerus under control, which obviously relates greatly to throwing a baseball. You have to get strong at the end range of the motion, and once you are strong isometrically, you can activate those stretch reflex mechanisms. And the same thing with the throwing motion, which is just a greater dynamic of thoracic mobility as well as humeral rotation. So as we're watching the video, keep those things in mind, that it's not to your advantage just to throw somebody right into the RMT phases because it looks baseball specific. You have to get strong and stable, and these things have to be carefully periodized over the off season in terms of how you build the stretch reflex mechanism. Okay, so plyometric phases can be done throughout these motions through the use of handled medicine balls, ropes, kettlebells, and everything else. So we're going to go ahead and I exemplify some of these drills through the video. So Kevin, if you want to play the RMT video. Okay, starting off with chest, forehead, overhead. You notice how the stretch reflex is trying to limit ball-hand contact time. It can be linear, it can be lateral, it can be a little bit more specific through a single leg stabilization. Okay, this is humeral rotation. And notice how the stretch reflex is actually occurring on the back side. Here's a front view. Or with the rotational stabilization with stretch reflex of humeral rotation. This is throwing motion. Again, you notice how I'm always checking to see range of motion first before I get into the actual stretch reflex mechanism. Here it again is for the lateral sense. Now we're looking at hips. Again, checking my range of motion before I get into the stretch reflex. Stretch reflex on the alternate side. This is the same type of hips, but from a lateral sense. Again, range of motion first. This is the shoulders, linear sense. Check the range of motion, undergo the stretch reflex. Here's from the lateral sense. Again, stretch reflex here. This is hips, alignment lifts. Now we're getting into the hip alignment lift from the linear sense. Again, notice the thoracic mobility that is trained. Now again, everything we train first with an isometric on the slams. Notice the isometric, getting strong isometrically, which will lead into the drill here, which is the stretch reflex. Linear and lateral. Now kneeling will just take out the lower body and focus specifically on thoracic. Okay, so again, now we can go isometric into the stretch reflex or linear stretch reflex. So again, from the RNT motion, all of these motions need to be strong and stable in the weight room first. Once you're positive, you have control over a range of motion, whether it be thoracic mobility, shoulder mobility, hip mobility, scapular mobility, or just elbow extension mobility. Once you're strong and stable and you've identified what they can control, then you can identify what they can control from a fast dynamic motion, and you can actually intelligently get those stretch reflex mechanisms.
Due to some technical difficulties, our presenter, Pete Bommarito, has actually been kicked out of the session when our Illuminate Live program has a lot of participants with a lot of video. Sometimes we experience some technical difficulties as we're experiencing right now. So just hold tight, and Coach Bommarito will be back soon, and we will resume the presentation. Thank you. Coach Bommarito is officially back in the session, so we can resume where he left off with reactive neuromuscular training.
Kevin, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Welcome back.
Did I get logged off there for a second?
Yeah, we just experienced some difficulties when there's a lot of video and a lot of participants, so you can just pick up right where you left off.
All right, yeah, I apologize for that. I don't know where they cut me out, but I think I was going off for a few seconds. I'm back on resistance training. We're on the second bullet point. We're based on range of motion that they can control. So there's no set exercises. There's no set, philosophy on squat, on pressing, on pulling. You have to modify a squat or modify a press or a pull or posterior chain exercise based on what they can control. Now here's where the corrective complexes during rest periods really come into play. We can assign corrective exercises based on the limitation of range of motion to open up the range of motion of limitation. And isometrics are probably the most effective thing to do during what we call a corrective complex. Now here's where MAT Jumpstart really comes into play, and I'm going to detail this a little bit more when we get to the multidisciplinary approach section at the end. But I think it's definitely the people's advantage of being a performance coach to at the same time be a base neuromuscular therapist. Now, again, this isn't just a plug MAT, but MAT Jumpstart is a very, very good organized system to understand limitations of range of motion and how to open up and strengthen range of motion based on their limitations. It's not even really a massage or a neuromuscular technique. They're all based on exercise isometric ranges of motion. Okay, so going through some of the different resistance things, we're going to start to look at templates. So look at skeleton plans. But remember, these are just a skeleton plan. Modification depends on individualization of what they can control. So the plan is set in terms of general preparatory or conjugate dynamic or whatever. But again, the phases have to be individualized to the person. So if we have somebody for an off season, let's say 12 weeks, we want the following 5 phases to be in there. That's fine, but some people might need to be general preparatory phase for 4 weeks. Some people might be in it for 1 week. Or when they're in the general preparatory phase, how is each individualized exercise modified to that person? That is really the art and the science behind what a performance coach does. Okay, so now getting into GPP. This is a standard exercise protocol. Typically for the off season for high-level Major League Baseball players, we'll do 4 days of resistance work per week. Now, just so you guys can see it, we kind of cut it off. So if you look at the template itself, it has 2 days, an upper body day and a lower body day. Now, keep in mind there is a day 3 and a day 4, but it follows the same type of concept and flow. So every time you see the exercise, and you see a number 1 and number 2, it's what we will superset. So for baseball players, we use a lot of complexes, especially at the upper body, because I'm not necessarily worried about their bench press 1 rep max or anything like that. They have to undergo pressing mechanisms, but mainly the pressing mechanisms will be light and stabilization, like a dumbbell alternate press, supersetted with an isometric hammer row. Now, if you see the corrective that's right underneath number 2, that is where we put in the individualized effort. So let's say they have a scapulothoracic deficiency, or they have a rotational deficiency, or they have a humerotational deficiency. Anything upper body is going to limit their ability to maximize their strength through a pressing or pulling motion. We put it in right there. And again, that's where MAT Jumpstart isometrics are very, very effective, because if you look at a limited range of motion of pressing, and you consistently try to open up and strengthen a new range of motion in between each set, you're going to see a lot more efficiency within the pressing or the pulling mechanism itself. Okay, and then you look at day 2, we look at a basic lower body single leg strengthening exercise, followed immediately by an explosive jumping exercise. And then the corrective work could be anything at the ankle joint, at the knee joint, at the thoracic joint, at the hip and pelvic joint. anything that's limiting their ability to effectively get into a single leg motion or effectively get into an explosive motion is consistently worked on within this complex. When I'm talking about corrective complex, that's exactly what I mean. So a general preparatory phase is just getting them into the basics: pressing, pulling, squatting / single leg squatting, and posterior chain function. Okay, an advanced phase might be intensification, which is this slide here. So again, this is a 4-day lift with day 1 and day 2 actually highlighted. So intensification just means intensifying by increasing the resistance, increasing the volume, or increasing the tempo. The tempo is the speed of the lift. So if you look at on the Excel sheet there, you see the exercise lifts. Right next to it, you see a column called TEM. That is actually tempo. So the speed of the lift, what we believe in is eccentric is the first number, isometric is the second number, and concentric is the third number. So if you look at day 1 and you slide down to the third exercise, which is dumbbell shoulder matrix rear, front, and side, you're looking at a tempo of 1-3-1. That means that the concentric will be 1 second lift, the isometric will be a 3-second hold at the end range of motion, and the eccentric is a 1 second lower. For a band overhead tricep, the concentric will be 1, the hold at the top will be 1, and the eccentric will be a 2 count. This way you can actually start controlling the speed of the lift of what they can control, and a great way to intensify, especially for baseball players, is simply just increasing the tempo. This is very, very effective of doing high tempo lifts in regards to pulling and in regards to shoulder exercises, because the range of motion differentiation between pitchers versus position players or from person to person is going to be greatly variated. So a great way to get them stronger at different end ranges of motion of shoulder flexion or shoulder abduction is simply work on isometric strength within those ranges. Now looking at day 2, here's where we start to get a little bit intensified. So we start off with a basic single leg motion to get that unilateral strength. Then we want to intensify by doing heavy box squats. When we play the video, you're going to see different variations in terms of box squatting with use of camber bars and things like that puts a lot less stress on the scapulothoracic joint. Okay, another phase would be conjugate dynamic. Okay, the conjugate dynamic follows the same type of powerlifting system you'll see a lot of powerlifters use, like from the West Side techniques, where you have 1 max effort day and 1 dynamic day. Okay, there's nothing wrong with doing that with baseball players. You just have to be very, very careful with how you're implementing dynamic motions, which we'll demonstrate in the video. So day 1, upper body, you're looking at a lot of increased volume, increased tempo, as well as obviously increasing the overall resistance. Okay, now day 2 is our heavy max effort type lower body lift. So box squatting complex with a jump. Posterior chain is like a heavy reverse hyper, which it has high tempo work, maybe complex with a posterior chain exercise like a glute ham raise. Now, if you would look at the last half of this day, this is where we get into maybe like as a contrast to a heavy max effort lower like the box squatting, we might do a speed belt squat, or we might do a speed Kaiser bench. And again, a lot of those things will be demonstrated within the video we're going to play later on. Okay, the next very advanced phase is CAD. This stands for Canadian Ascending Descending. So if you look at the red bar that has outlined the phase CAD, Canadian Ascending Descending is actually a technique that was devised by a couple of very, very high-level performance coaches in Canada for track sprinters. All we did was we modified it for baseball players. So if you look at the 4-set complex, so identify day 1, you're going to see 1, 2, 3, and 4. The main concept of this is you're gradually increasing the speed at the beginning, you're increasing the strength at the end. So you could do like a speed reverse band fly with a speed Kaiser row, with a seated band row, which now increases the intensity and decreases the speed, followed by a very, very heavy strength row. And then everything was supersetted. So you go from exercise 1, no rest, right in exercise 2, no rest, right in exercise 3, with no rest in exercise 4. Then you take about a 2 to 3 minute break in between those complexes, work on some corrective work, then you get right back into the next round. So the heaviest intense I've seen is we actually do 5 full rounds of this entire 4-set complex. and then you end with some speed pressing with some heavy dumbbell pressing. Now day 2 follows the same complex. You notice exercise number 1 is a very, very light, heavy speed-based exercise. Then exercise number 2 will be a little bit slower, a little bit heavier. Exercise number 3 will be a little bit slower, a little bit heavier, followed by exercise 4, which is just a max effort lift. And you see the tempo is 1-1 star. Star just means explode. But again, you know, a set of 5 on a box squat, you might be up to in the ranges of 85 to 88%, which means that your intent is to move the weight fast, but the actual bar speed itself will be slower based on the amount of resistance that you have. Okay, and then obviously on day 3 and day 4, it follows the exact same pattern, except for you start with your max effort strength and you end with your body weight type explosive work. So day 1, day 2 are ascending from speed to strength. Day 3 and day 4 will be the same complex, but you will descend from strength to speed, which is technically the ascending, descending. And then we like to end up later on, again, if the athlete can handle these power-based motions with like a standard strength power split. So this one will actually be doing full body complexes every day. So if you look at day 1 is all strength, day 2 is all speed. Okay, so if you look at day 1, what the superset is a heavy press, superset with a heavy leg exercise. Then we go into some corrective work. Then we go back in, set number 2, you go to your heavy press upper body with your heavy hip quad dominant motion lower body, complex with a corrective. Okay, and then you look at day 2, it'll be all of our speed motions. So we'll still be doing lower body motions, which you see by the seated box jump, the band hitting chops, which we demonstrated in the power endurance video, the speed single arm low row, which we'll demonstrate here in a minute, followed by some corrective work. And then if you look at the lower body hamstring, the heavy exercise is the hyper, the speed exercise is the dynamic speed hamstring slide. So again, a really, really good complex of getting lower and upper body on both days, but one day is focused on max strength, and one day is focused primarily on power. Power and speed of thoracic motions, of rowing motions, pressing motions, and even posterior chain function. Okay, so at this time, we'll go ahead and we'll play the lower body strength video. Now this will actually demonstrate some of the exercise that you saw within the skeleton plans. This is a belt squat, very, very popular motion for baseball players because it takes all the load off the scapulothoracic region and places it on the lower body. So see, the weight is actually attached to my hips. So you can do dynamic motions, you can do heavy motions, you can do high-speed dynamic eccentric loads. The box squat we typically do with the camber bar. So here's from the side view of the actual box squat. But for throwing motions, again, the camber bar allows my hands to be down by my waist, which takes a lot of the stress off my scapulothoracic region, which is a great individualization for baseball players. Now, single leg motions, the Bulgarian squat, the wheelbarrow dumbbell motion, again, allow me for good stabilization. If I'm doing something single leg like a step up, again, we try to use the camber bar. A split squat backward lunge, we try to elevate the front foot so the back knee actually drops below the front foot. Posterior chain function. Reverse hyper, this is actually identifying the range of motion that I can control of flexion and extension. Some high tempo unloaded work. Another resistance mechanism can just be standard manual resistance. Again, a great way to control what I can control. And then more dynamic posterior functions, which is reverse hyper with plate loaded. Pull-throughs are a great way to just identify slow motions of the same posterior chain function. This is actually hip extension with knee flexion of a full glute ham raise. Or floor glute ham raises, which is the next exercise shown, can just focus on hip stabilization with knee eccentric loading extension and concentric knee flexion. Isolation of knee flexion could be done with a band or manual resistance prone or machine prone. And then we're looking at more sport-specific posterior chain function. This is hip extension with dumbbell work. This is knee extension with dumbbell work. Or getting into really heavy loaded motions of hip extension function, the posterior chain, which is a single leg RDL. You can do a split stance RDL. This is great for baseball because it involves thoracic rotation stability with hip extension, or overload the thoracic mobility option, which you see here by the overhead split stance motion. Okay, Kevin, so if we want to move into the upper body strength video now. Okay, this is a basic dumbbell press. Again, notice my 2-0-1 tempo. Or going into an alternate function, which one arm will be straight and stable as the other arm goes through the pressing motion. Or a great core exercise would just be a simple stabilization through the thoracic region as I'm going through a pressing motion. If you want to get into dynamic pressing, we like to use the Kaiser. Slow, that would be like a 2-1 star tempo, or star 1 star tempo, or star 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 tempo. You're getting great control weight. This is an isometric way, so actually holding for us a 1 count with a 3-second eccentric. Again, building a lot of volume. This is an isometric way, holding for a 6 count. Doing a rep in between. Coming back up, holding for a 5 count. This is an isolated single arm rowing motion. Again, notice the humeral rotation with the rowing motion. Or basic heavy shoulder exercise. You start to get into more variation of the single leg rowing with a hyper. This is a prone row that works on extension and rowing simultaneously, or done with humeral rotation with a kettlebell. This is the seated heavy band row. This is the speed band row, speed band high row, speed band mid row. Elbow extensors, you want to control it. Again, notice how my humerus is set, and I'm isolating the motion of elbow flexion. Same thing, humerus is set from a different angle, putting a little bit of a different emphasis on the elbow extensors. Again, a lot of this stuff can be done with bands, whether it be slow or fast motions. It's forward grip. Here we're moving into reverse grip. Okay, now if we want to go into the corrective video there, Kevin. Okay, this is a lot of the corrective work we do. This is a basic shoulder extension in the horizontal function with scapular function. These can be used as great preparation exercises. Now the chops and the lift series you saw throughout the program, this is the basic standing chop. This is the alignment chop. This is a great way to strengthen. This is the standing lift. So chops and lifts is a great way to get strong and stable at the end range of motion of thoracic mobility, which will lead you into those R&T phases. Now this is the high tempo work. Notice how the 1 3-second hold with the 1 second down. This is the bent thumbs up T-raise, working on a little bit more scapular. This works on humeral rotation. Notice the external rotation at the end range of motion. Now we're looking at a shoulder raise with an extended shoulder raise, the V to Y. Looking on humeral rotation, this is a great humeral strengthening exercise. Identify those end ranges of motion before we get into the RTA motion, RTS, or the R&T motions. This is a thumbs up Y raise bent, a thumbs down T raise bent, thumbs up W raise bent. Again, notice all the 1-3-1 tempos. These are basic scapular mobility drills. We call these shoulder blade push-up hands, shoulder blade push-up elbows. This is a humeral rotation and humeral extension strengthening drill. Again, identifying my ends of motion, getting isometrically strong. Notice the 1-3-1. This is the basic posture exercise, working on not only thoracic stability, but also humeral motion. Look at an internal rotation with the external rotation resistance back, so like an eccentric humeral rotation motion. Again, don't think of this as rotator cuff. Think of this as getting strong to the end ranges of motion of humeral function with the elbow bent at 90 degrees. This is also a great scapular pre-ed because it sets the scapular position set. This is a different humeral rotation. Again, you want to hit it from all angles. Notice how I'm hitting it from a standing position. I'm hitting it from a cross-seated position. I'm hitting it from a side-lying position. So we're pretty much almost trying to cover every single motion of the scapulothoracic joint and trying to get strong and identify ranges of motion. Now this is just a basic front raise. Again, notice the 1-3-1 tempo or basic side raise. with the 1-3-1 tempo. Lightweight, increasing the tempo really allows you to control the range of motion. If you want to do dynamic motions, that's what the R&T and the power endurance phases are for. Basic rear delt raise. Okay, now, moving into the core video, we like to use the use of landmines a lot. A landmine is a very, very cheap, efficient tool. It doesn't take a lot of space. It allows you to work on a lot of the basic thoracic mobility. So if you're looking at how to strengthen thoracic mobility, identify joint ranges of motion, so a linear, a lateral, or a reverse sense, or again, take out the lower body, just trying to completely isolate the thoracic motion of linear, of lateral, or of the reverse sense from a kneeling position. Okay? Now, I wanted to follow up with what I believe, again, is one of the most underrated aspects of baseball development, which is a multidisciplinary approach. Now, keep in mind that if your facility does not have everything in-house, it doesn't underestimate the importance of how to utilize these things. Okay? Now, again, you're going to see a lot of crossover. I'm not saying that all physical therapists are going to be trained in ART, kinesiotaping, are going to be athletic trainers, and train neuromuscular therapists. But these are the types of specialization that you might want to think about when you're trying to identify which physical therapist you're going to use. Chiropractors, again, I mean, I've seen chiropractors that are not certified in grafting, but grafting technique is a very, very effective tool that chiropractors use. I mean, we're not big on backcrackers, people that just want to adjust. I mean, a lot of times things such as acupuncture, neuromuscular therapy techniques, grafting techniques will allow for proper spinal function and identification of spinal deficiencies. Massage therapy, again, you're going to see this MAT. So Greg Roscoff's muscle activation techniques are very, very efficient. My belief is that all performance coaches have a base understanding of joint positions. And the jumpstart facet of MAT, you don't even need to be a licensed massage therapist in order to practice it, because it's not a manual technique. It's an exercise isometric-based technique. However, a lot of our massage therapists are certified at the higher levels of MAT, which mainly works on pressure points and manipulation of tissue, which is a very, very, very good specialization that you need to look for if you're trying to identify a good massage therapist. Now, biomechanist, in my opinion, is everybody that's listening in right now. If you're a sport coach trying to look for drills for your kids, if you're a performance coach at any level, you are a high-speed biomechanist. This is the final tie-in to where all the disciplines not only overlap, because everybody has their own individual specialization, but a lot of crossover is going to happen. Okay, so I don't think there's anything wrong with biomechanists or strength coaches being Jumpstart certified, which ties into the massage therapy. So if isometric-based training will open up ranges of motion based on strength levels and allow for more identification, and then anything that's severe can be passed on to the different modalities of PTs, chiropractors, massage therapists, and so on and so forth. Obviously, orthopedic is the last function to be had. So if you have a severe injury, athletic trainer is first identified, goes to the orthopedist, filters back down between the therapist, and ends up with a performance coach. In my opinion, it doesn't need to be segmented out of injury, surgery, post-op surgery, rehab, and then performance training. I think performance training needs to be throughout the entire process of detraining before surgery, in conjunction rehab, post-surgery, and obviously by the time they're ready for high-speed dynamic motions, we are trained to continue that type of a facet. Okay, logistics. Obviously, price is a thing because not all insurance is going to cover every single medical discipline thought of. So I look at it as the evaluation and relationships. So performance coaches not only have to have good relationships with all the different medical disciplines, but the respect and the transfer has to be back and forth. But most important, if price is an issue, in my opinion, the evaluations from every medical discipline is absolutely necessary. Now, again, I mean, it's based on what the logistics are. What can your clients afford versus what can you have in-house versus what you have to outsource. But the more you develop relationships in the field, a lot better you're going to be able to recommend your clients, at least to get evaluated so you get a baseline of where to start and what restrictions you have to start with. And it's up to the performance coach to continue to progress based on the limitation of restrictions and how you can fix it. Now, the functionality, in my opinion, the overlapping is a positive. The information is the key. So if a performance coach understands continuing education and understands the different disciplines and what they do, it's going to lead for a lot more effectiveness for the client. Now, implementation, the training methods to constantly modify. Whether you are or are not trained in any neuromuscular techniques, you have to understand structure. How does the body function, and how is your current client functioning? Okay, now how do you identify what range of motion they can and can't control? Work within that range initially and open up the range and stabilize the range in order to progress. But most importantly, train methods to work with athletes' ability at any given time. That means that you have to understand that the range of motion could open up from rep to rep, from set to set, from workout to workout. Try not to overextend an athlete's control range of motion at that time because of what your ultimate goal for them might be. That leads to a lot of overuse injuries. So as long as performance coaches are trained biomechanists, you're going to have a lot more efficiency in terms of the multidisciplinary approach. Okay, Kevin, I think we're moving on to the Q&A section.
Coach Bommarito, thank you for presenting today's webinar. We here at the NSCA really appreciate your contribution to the field. Your discussion on off-season development for elite and professional baseball players was extremely informative and well done. At this time, we invite all participants to continue to use the chat function located on the left-hand side of your screen to submit your questions for Coach Bommarito. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions, and we'll kick off with one question here that came to us pretty early on in the presentation. Coach, what type of subjective testing do you perform with your baseball athletes to help assess their abilities?
Well, you have to look at the what and the why. Okay, first off is the what. What is out of alignment? Now, you look at a lot of the different organizations out there that put together really, really organized assessment values. You're looking at, Greg Cook's functional movement screen. You're looking at NASM and their overhead squat assessment, a lot of the different assessments that's regarded within the NASM. Those will actually tell you the what. Okay, what is out of alignment? Is the ankle joint, knee joint, hip joint, shoulder joint, thoracic joint? Okay, if it's out of alignment, that's great to know what, but then again, you have to know why. If you're trying to do an overhead squat assessment and you see the right foot turn out with the left foot straight, you see the right knee deviate in or out with the left knee straight, if you start to see twisting of the spine or limitations with humeral rotation, but that will tell you the what. The why, in my opinion, is neuromuscular based. So we'll do both. We'll do those assessments to find out the what is wrong, but why it's wrong. Okay, that's where the MAT Jumpstart is so valuable, because it's a great evaluation tool at every joint to see what the athlete is capable at that given time. And keep in mind, this is a changing thing. So I'm not saying that we do a full MAT Jumpstart evaluation with every single athlete before every single exercise, but we'll start to notice trends over time. Okay, so when he came in with this injury and he's rehabbing it, we started to see limitation of hip external rotation. We started to see limitations with thoracic mobility of the left side with deep side bend. We'll start to see limitations of humeral mobility. And if those things are consistently coming up within an evaluation, we know exactly where to attack it on which day after which type of a training mechanism. And once we start to learn the athlete, learn trends over time, we are consistently reevaluating not only the what, but most importantly is the why. So what is all the standard evaluation techniques I just listed? The why, in my opinion, is definitely neuromuscular based.
So you use all three. You use the MAT Jumpstart, the NASM overhead deep squat, and the functional movement screen to assess?
Well, definitely. I mean, obviously there's a lot more out there. I'm just kind of listing the more popular ones. And most importantly, I'm making sure I make clear that the majority of the popular ones out there will tell you what is wrong. But you have to identify why it's wrong and what you need to be able to do to fix it. And one of the most important things we're finding is isometrics at end range of motion will actually open up the end range of motion, which is strength-based, not flexibility-based. I mean, most importantly, if something is tight or something appears tight, it might not be a muscle lengthening issue. The tightness that you're seeing from one side to the next is definitely a product of being weak within an increased range. So if you just stretch it out, it's guarding, it's tight for a reason. Why is it tight? It's tight because that athlete can't control any increased range of motion. So if you just open up the range of motion, without functioning control, that's where you're going to start to see a lot of injuries. We have a lot more success with speed, R&T, strength, if we see something that's tight, identify why it's tight, and when we open it up, we strengthen that new range before we start to get into dynamic motions.
So it's a stability first approach, more or less.
I'd say strength first approach.
Okay.
You know, the majority of the tightnesses we find are not muscle lengthening issues. They are strength issues at increased ranges of motion. So we strengthen isometrically at the increased range of motion, and that's why MAT Jumpstart is a great tool, because it's a very, very organized educational approach for a lot of coaches that have.
Okay. So we're going to jump into our next question here. When working on baseball stealing, what do you teach as the first movement from the lower extremities?
It's a lateral shift. Okay, so if you watch the one video that we had where I was just doing a shift, if I'm standing and I have to basically run to my right, okay, so I'm on first base, I get my lead off, and my right foot is closest to second base. My center of mass technically is, I'd say, you know, on average you could say that it's probably from my nose to my belly button. You have to shift your center of mass over your right foot in order to use your right foot in order to propel you into your first step acceleration. So that's where that edge work comes into play. So most people have the ability to shift, they just don't have the ability to shift over the right foot and use the outside edge of the right foot in order to propel them into acceleration. So a lot of times we won't just work on the mechanics of the shift, we'll work on the mechanics of getting comfortable of accelerating off the outside edge of the right foot. So you saw the drills that I was doing in the videos, such as the lateral wall drill and the Karaka quick step. It's a great function to get that comfort level of accelerating off the outside edge. When you start to complex those drills with a standard base stealing start, you're going to see them naturally and a lot more dynamically undergo that shift because they had that ability now of accelerating off the outside edge of the right foot.
Okay. Definitely agree with that, and you bring a great approach to teaching those movements. So
well, I'd say that one of the biggest things you see is people look at mechanics too much. You know, what is most mechanically efficient on a base stealing start? But you have to look at, does the athlete have the physiological ability to do what it is that is most efficient? Most people don't. That's why drilling, as opposed to teaching, is a lot more effective motion. We don't even really talk about the shift so much. We just drill it so much and complex. Like we'll do some base stealing starts, do some lateral wall drills, do some base stealing starts, do some Karaka quick step, do some base stealing. Just keep going back and forth. We're going to start to see the ability of the athlete just happen naturally without actually trying to get them to think about too many things like the shifts and so on and so forth.
Okay, so those drills just become so inherent that those motor patterns are developed and it just kind of transfers by itself, more or less?
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it.
All right, so due to time constraints, we're going to have to end the question and answer section.